Lots of discussion about Ukraine and its future with NATO. Hi, I'm Brian Lilley, political columnist with the Toronto Sun. You've been hearing about the attempts by U.S. President Donald Trump to end the war in Ukraine. Discussions ongoing with Russia as we speak, with perhaps Ukraine being sidelined at the moment. One of the positions that we've heard about is not allowing Ukraine to join NATO in the future. Joining me to talk about this is Peter MacKay. He is a partner at Deloitte, consulting firm. He's formerly Canada's defense minister from, what was it, Peter, 2017 to 13, a couple of years there?
6 years, I think, in total.
I wanted to bring you on because of a story that you told me once, and I don't think you said it to me on video, but we were talking, and you described what it was like when Ukraine was rejected for NATO membership before, because you were in the room, if memory serves me. Is that right?
Yeah, that was a NATO meeting in April of 2008 in Bucharest, Romania, of all places, in this incredible Ceausescu palace. But the meeting that took place was discussing, among other things, Afghanistan, of course, was raging, but the ascendancy of certain countries, or what they called a membership action plan, Brian. And some of the countries being discussed at that time were Bosnia, Georgia, and Ukraine. And as we will know, as history will tell us, neither of the Ukrainian or Belarusian plans were given that green light to proceed to membership for NATO. And there were obviously a lot of knock-on consequences for that. As we saw things unfold in Ukraine in particular, we saw the annexation of Crimea, and then, of course, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by the Russians in February of 2023.
So tell me then about the meeting and how it went down, because Canada was backing Ukraine for membership in NATO, weren't we?
We were indeed. And in fact, Canada has long been one of the most ardent supporters of Ukraine on the international scene. Of course, the first to recognize Ukraine's independence. We have over a million Canadians of Ukrainian descent. And at that particular meeting, Prime Minister Harper, myself, others from the department were there, actively promoting this first step, and it's a preliminary step, membership action, to allow Ukraine to join. And there was quite a lot of debate and a lot of pushback.
Who was against Ukraine joining NATO, and why?
Well, the countries that I remember being most ardent in their opposition were France and Germany. Kind of ironic given where we are today, and I suspect we'll have a chance to chat about that too. But the pushback was that Ukraine wasn't ready. There was still a lot of corruption, and they weren't entirely wrong. But Canada, in addition to being supportive of joining NATO, was also quite active in their supports on the ground. That is to say, helping them building governance capacity, helping them with election monitoring, internal capacity building is what Canadians were doing, and they were doing very well at it. And so
I remember we were sending teams of people. I knew people with various political parties who would go over as observer groups
that's right.
to help monitor elections or help them set up how to run the votes.
That's exactly right. And so there was, I think, a lot of progress being made that didn't get properly enunciated or acknowledged at that meeting. But I have this vivid memory, Brian, of sort of one of the breaks in the official program and looking over in the corner, and there was George Bush, Nicolas Sarkozy, and Angela Merkel, and they were having a heated discussion, which I interpreted as their attempts to sort of tell the Americans that really there was no way that Ukraine should be accepted into NATO at this point. And I think there was an underlying fear then, as now, that NATO membership would so enrage Vladimir Putin and the Russians that this would result in a conflict. Well, again, how ironic.
I mean, I've never bought the argument that Russia can't have NATO on its doorstep. We've had Turkey as a member, although I don't think Turkey is an actual ally, and I question their value in the alliance. But we've long had NATO members on Russia's borders. So
But look at the
about
Baltics, the
yeah,
Baltic countries. And I mean, one of the unintended consequences of the invasion by Russia to Ukraine was the fact that Sweden and Finland are now in the alliance. And so that this issue of NATO membership somehow being a threat to Russia, um, it's not really accurate in terms of what those countries are doing. They're a part of the alliance to protect themselves from Russia,
mhm.
to allow for this all for one approach under Article 5 that says if national sovereignty is breached, we, the alliance, will rally around the country that's under attack. And so, instead of going back, we should be looking forward. But had Ukraine been given the membership, or at least the path, there would have been an incentive for them to do more. There would have been a deterrent effect, which is what this Article 5 is all about. And I question whether, Crimea would have ever been annexed and whether this full-scale war would have ever broken out. Clearly, the alliance would have been obligated to come in a much more substantive way to the aid of Ukraine.
And George Bush was obviously in favor of Ukraine joining NATO at that time, right?
That was my feeling. I mean, based on things that he'd said in other meetings, his position seemed to become more ambivalent as the meeting went on. And I was communicating sort of on the sidelines with Condoleezza Rice on various issues at the same time. And we went into the meeting certainly expecting that this membership action plan could at least begin. And
Uh,
I mean,
and,
not to get off track, but it didn't work out so well for Belarus or Georgia either.
no, and here we are. We'll see what the negotiations, what the agreement looks like. We don't really know, but one of the ways to end the war may end up being giving Putin part of what he wants, which is no Ukraine in NATO, as a
And
way
that would
to
be
end the
unfortunate, to
fight.
say the least. To give in essentially to Putin's demands after all of the horrific things that he has orchestrated in Ukraine, removing children, the incredible rack and ruin that has been befallen Ukraine. And look, the casualties are shocking. It's easy to lose sight of that statistic alone, and it doesn't tell the whole tale. Hundreds of thousands of people killed or injured, and of course, many displaced Ukrainians that have fled to neighboring countries like Poland. So Putin getting away with this and getting his way is really untenable, which is why you're hearing President Zelensky, as well as European countries, sort of pushing back on what appears to be a preemptive positioning by the Americans, and saying outright, as Pete Hegseth did at a NATO meeting recently, that the borders will never be restored to the way they were. Well, again, putting it in card terms, you shouldn't be playing all those cards before you even really sit down and look the Russians in the eye about a negotiation to end the war.
I I mean, I hope they get back the territory that they've lost since 2023. I think the world lost an opportunity in not standing up against Putin when he annexed Crimea in 2014. That
No
should have
question.
been taken care of at the time. And unfortunately, President Obama was famous for red lines that were crossed over and over again.
Well, that's true. That's certainly true of Syria, but it was true of what happened in Ukraine, and there's all these other knock-on effects by losing that important part of Crimea from Ukraine. They lost access to the Black Sea. It was the port in which they were able to send many of the grains and the foodstuffs to places like Africa. So there's been huge knock-on effects going back to 2014, as you've said, with that annexation of Crimea.
Peter MacKay, thanks so much for your time today.
My pleasure, Brian.
Let me know what you think. Drop a comment down below and share this on social media.